Hi, I'm Dr. Howard Spearman, President of Rock Valley College, and I want to thank you for joining us on PERC Up with the President. When we talk about PERC, we're really talking about persistence, enrollment, retention, and completion. And when you add all of those things up, you really get student success. And so I'm excited today to really talk about PERC Up from the lens of one of our very own Rock Valley College professors, Dr. Mathew Oakes. And so now I'm going to have Dr. Mathew Oakes introduce himself, and then we'll continue with our coffee chat. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Matt Oakes. I just said I was going to call myself Matthew, but I'm going to back up. Dr. Mathew Oakes. I teach writing and literature at Rock Valley. I've been here for about 10 years, and I teach a variety of writing and literature courses, work on a variety of campus projects, including co-chair of PACE, which stands for Promoting an Inclusive Community, where we work on social justice and equity projects and advocacy on campus. Glad to be here. Looking forward to chatting with Dr. Spearman.
So, Matt, when it comes to PERC, when it comes to persistence, enrollment, retention, completion, speak to us about how you would define it or how you have engaged students around PERC.
I think that when I start, as a classroom instructor, it's always about one-on-one interactions with students. It's like, what is this particular student's story and experience, strengths, obstacles, what's going to keep them in the chair, what's going to bounce them out of the chair, and then how do I use whatever I have at my disposal to make sure that that person makes it through my class successfully and then has whatever they need for my class to be successful in the next class. So I always just think that it's ultimately about me as a person meeting them as a person and showing up as a professional who can help them in whatever way I can. So
you and I have worked together for a few years now, and I've come to learn that you have a pretty engaging personality. Does that help you in the classroom? Do you see that other students are gravitating towards your personality? How does that really impact the learning environment?
I think that there are always a few students who don't think I'm funny, and that always, I'm like, that hurts, that really hurts. But no, I think that it does. I think it helps. I think that I know that I can, when I walk through the classroom door, I see like the light go on about like, you're on air now, and I need to like kick it into gear. And so that is an intentional choice that I'm making to like bring myself to the room. But then I think there are other times, like when we're doing workshopping in my writing classes, where I'll tell them, like, I'm not going to say much today. Like, I'm here if you need me, but I'm just sort of in the back of the room. So I think that it helps that, I think that if you have a big personality, that if it's not then paired with actually caring deeply about your students, then it's kind of hollow. But if you have a personality that people find interesting or compelling or gravitating or funny or whatever, but when that's coupled with actual care and concern, I think that's kind of the magic sauce there.
So then why don't you share with us one of the jokes that you provide in class? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But when it comes to, you mentioned green light. And when you said green light and the camera's on, you're really saying, you have the student's attention and they're ready. And how you're going to provide that. What is it like for you? What is it that allows you to have the green light?
I think that it's knowing your stuff, like knowing your material, like knowing, if not necessarily like every word that's going to come out of your mouth that day, but just kind of where you're starting and where you want the class to be at the end. And that sense of a professional calling, like that this is something I want to do, that I want to be engaged in, and then like I said at the beginning, knowing my students' stories. Like I find if I'm tired, if I'm kind of burned out, or it's Thursday afternoon and I'm looking for the next day when I don't have to teach, when I go through the classroom door and I see a student that I'm like, oh right, he or she's been struggling with X. Okay, that's meaningful, right? That's motivating to me.
How long have you been teaching, or how long have you been a faculty member?
So I've been at Rock Valley for 10, and I started teaching in grad school 15 years ago. So 15, 16. almost 16 years.
16 years and counting.
Yeah.
What are some of the strategies you like to use when you're teaching? I always think about dynamic personalities. I always think about classroom management. But connecting to students, strategies for engaging students, it's so different for every faculty member. So what are some of the strategies that you use?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think I do have some, especially if I'm teaching like a lecture-based course, like some of my literature courses where I'm doing more lecturing. I have some stock jokes that I know will work. I think that working with people's expectations and then confounding them is a strategy that I use. I think that, I was talking about this with someone yesterday, that I think that I grew up, went through higher education myself as a student with that very like stodgy sort of tweed jacket with the elbow patches kind of professors until I got further on in my grad school journey. And I think that a lot of our students show up and they expect that. And I think that I sort of intentionally try to subvert that by presenting myself in a different way, being more casual, being more inviting, owning my mistakes. Like I think that's the stuff that people respond to, that they're like, oh, interesting. You know, knowing what kind of questions are common at that particular moment. You know, I'll use that phrase a lot. Like a lot of students have trouble with this concept, and it kind of, I think, opens that door and invites people to go, oh yeah, I wasn't quite sure what that meant, or that. I think that's just being human and showing up and working with what I've got.
So in working with what you got, how do you meet the student where he or she's at and still be there to help the student who is very ambitious, understands that, you know, they want more and more out of this class? So if you have these different dynamics daily, how do you juggle between the dynamics?
Well, that's one of the reasons that I really enjoy teaching writing, because we're in a lab, we're in a computer lab. So I don't do a lot of from the front lecturing during my writing classes, especially not once we get into the middle or the end of the semester. It's a lot of workshopping. And in that case, I can go one student at a time. And that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is just either one at a time or in groups of 2 or 3 or something, working with students directly. And so I will, if I'm putting students into groups, I will make those choices consciously about, okay, I know that that student's really eager. I'll pair them up with a student who might be struggling, and then that student who's doing really well is able to use their skills in a different way, but to help this other student. Or if I'm working with that exceptional student one-on-one, I will push them further and say, you know, if you only have to do 5 sources, why don't you look for 2 more? Or here's an even more advanced idea that you could work with. You don't have to. You know, this is the bench lab. You have to be here, but you seem like you could go here, so why don't we go there? And because I have a smaller class for a writing class, and we're in a writing lab, I can do that.
So this is where higher education is different, very unique compared to some other professions, right? So here you are talking about a writing lab, but the students are in front of computers. Well, how is it a writing lab if they're in front of computers? I understand it, but break it down in layman terms. What does that really mean?
Yeah, I mean, a writing class is not just about grammar. I mean, that's the most common misconception. I teach very, very little grammar. I was at a party with friends, and someone's mom was there, and she said, I pay my taxes, you better be teaching them grammar if you're an English instructor. And I was like, first of all, lady, I don't work for you, but, you know, okay. I was like, that's not what I do. That's, we're working on ideas around argument, purpose, audience, voice, research, digital literacy, reading texts, reading audio texts, reading visual texts. So we're doing a lot of different work. And of course, especially in like a research writing class, that research, yes, there are books upstairs here in the library, but most of that stuff is online. And so they have to have access to a computer in order to make that work happen. Plus, I mean, so many of the collaborative tools, if we do peer review, we use Google Docs or different tools that we have at our disposal here at the college to do that kind of collaborative work. And it's not writing something down on a piece of paper and handing it to someone across the desk from you. It's sharing the files and using the comment features and so on and so forth. And I think that that's why we're in a computer lab. You know, we used to, when I first started, we were only in a computer lab 50% of the time. And I always felt really hamstrung in that environment because on that day we weren't in the classroom, or weren't in the computer lab, and we were just in a regular classroom. I always felt like we couldn't do the things that I really wanted us to be doing if we had been in the lab. And when we renovated Classroom Building 1 and we were able to expand the number of computer labs we have on campus for writing classes, I was able to actually do that, to just be in the computer lab 100% of the time and have that experience, have that opportunity.
It's interesting that you speak about the importance of the computer as a part of your classroom experience. In our first episode, in our pilot episode with Dr. Pacino, she was talking about online learning. And one of the topics we talked about was digital divide. And so, what's your opinion of digital divide or that gap? And you're talking about access to computers and for our community. How important is that for you?
I mean, it's crucial. You know, I'll pull up a student's paper in our learning management system to start grading it or commenting on it. And I can almost always tell when it's a student who's completed it on their smartphone. Because of course you can't format a research paper very well if you're just, you know, using your Android or your iPhone or something. And that's, I think, oftentimes, I don't run into a lot of students anymore who just don't have access, like zero. Every now and then I will. It's usually that someone's like, oh, I've got my phone. And they're trying to do all of this really complicated work, research. I mean, managing multiple PDFs of, you know, peer-reviewed journal articles that they've downloaded from EBSCO or something. And they're trying to do it on their phone. And it's just, I mean, you can't do it. It's not going to work. And I think that's where we sit. Or students who have a laptop, but it's a piece of junk. And it's a hand-me-down from grandma or somebody's aunt or something. And it just doesn't work. And so they end up spending half their time trying to get this thing to do what they want it to do. Or it's a lack of familiarity. You know, we think that, especially young students, students who are 17, 18, 20, 21, we think that they are digital natives. And they are with devices, like mobile devices, but they are not digital natives with Microsoft Word or Excel or PowerPoint. Those are not tools that they typically have a lot of exposure to. And so when we ask them, you know, if I said, send me a tweet, they probably could get that done in 5 seconds, but format a document with a hanging indent in MLA style using Microsoft Word, you know, that's not where they're coming from. Those are not the digital tools they're familiar with. So I think it's that. It's any combination of those things. And then for that occasional student, it's all of those things together. They're working on their phone. They don't know what the heck Microsoft Word is. Their computer crapped out. They're trying to get it to work, or they're hotspotting it off their phone. Like all of those things. And then, of course, the work they turn in is down here because they're using all of this mental energy trying to overcome this digital divide, this gap, that they can't spend their time actually learning what I need them to learn in the class. And I think that's what it is.
Well, I'm pretty sure there's no secret that we're primarily online due to COVID.
Wait, was I supposed to be teaching online? I've just been sitting in my classroom wondering where my students are.
Oh, say it's not so. No. So what have you done to adjust to connect with students when they're primarily online, or this is not the days where students picked online classes versus the first face-to-face class, right? Yeah. So they all have to do some form of online. So what have you done to change up your style to engage those students?
I think that it's ultimately about like setting clear expectations from the beginning and then following through on those expectations. So at the beginning of this semester, I got so many questions, so much anxiety from students about like how long it was going to take for them to get feedback on a project or grade, or how long was it going to take me to respond to an email or something. And so I just try to regularly communicate what those expectations are. I will grade this assignment within the next 2 days or 7 days or whatever, whatever the framework happens to be for that project. And then unless you know, come hell or high water, I try to make that deadline so that that consistency and that expectation is followed through, so that they know that there's one less thing that's unreliable, or one less thing that's going to have something that can go wrong that they're not anticipating. So I try to just be as steady and calm. I think that's probably the difference, is that I'm trying to just be as not boring, but just there, you know, dependable, that I'm doing what they think I should be doing when they think I should be doing it, within my own boundaries of, you know, professional life. But I think too that it's about doing things that I might not necessarily feel are, I don't want to say authentic, but like, you know, I'm not like a good job buddy kind of guy. Like sometimes I see those emails from people and I'm like, no thanks. Like sometimes it sounds a little vague to my ear. But I have to remember, my wife reminded me of this. She's like, students don't know the difference. Like if you're like, hey, that was awesome, or if you're like, hey, that was awesome, when you're typing it, right? Like what matters is you send that information out, that you saw them working, you saw them turning things in, and, you know, adding those extra pieces of feedback that aren't necessarily tied to a grade or tied to something that you want them to do differently, but just sort of like I see you over there doing that thing that you're doing. And then later on this semester, trying to adapt some things that I didn't really do this in the first half of the semester because I was still trying to figure things out, but I do a lot of one-on-one conferencing with students. And so then trying to figure out how to make that happen in a manageable way via Zoom at home. And, you know, it means that my dog and my kids are popping into my one-on-one conferences with my students from home, but, you know, so are theirs. And so it's just, right. You know, that's just where we're at.
Well, tell your wife I absolutely agree with her.
Yeah.
I'm learning, you know, as I am new in my role as president, I'm learning that due to COVID, not everybody's on campus, right? So you can't stop by everybody's office and say hello, you know, or look at their office hours and just walk past and say, hey, how's it going? How you doing? You can't do that. Right. So, you know, trying to maybe call somebody, you know, can you imagine that people actually call?
Right.
You know, you call somebody and say hello. That's, you know, people don't do that as much anymore. But also, I'm learning that you still have to engage through email. Mm-hmm. You know, you may not say it the way you always want to say it, but it's important to do the outreach, do the connection, and then you just hope, that it's interpreted the way you want it to be interpreted. Right. But I'm learning that some form of engagement is better than no engagement, and that's what I'm learning in my role. And but I'm assuming some students will love it, and other students are like, eh.
Well, and I think too, you can never judge, you know, a student's reaction or lack of a reaction doesn't mean that it didn't have an impact. Like, yeah, sometimes students will email back and be like, hey, thanks, I really appreciate your positive feedback. And I'm like, oh, great. Like if I did it for that one person, great. But I always think, like, when I buy something online and then it gets delivered and then I get the email from Etsy or Target or whatever that says, hope you enjoyed your purchase, I just delete the email, but I'm like, oh, Target, Etsy. You know, I get that it closes that loop in a way, right? And I have a positive response to that thing, even though I didn't respond to it officially. And I think that's something to keep in mind as well, that I don't know what's going on in a student's life when their phone dings and it's an alert from me that says, hey, saw you turn that in on time, great job. You know, and they could be, I mean, seriously, I've had students responding to me from the ER because they're, you know, dealing with COVID with themselves or a loved one. And I always think, well, maybe those alerts are hitting them in that moment where they're like, okay, there is life outside of what I'm dealing with right now, and then it's a positive association with Rock Valley, with my class, with their learning goals, with their, you know, whatever it is that they're trying to get done for themselves and their families.
I think that's key. So many students come on campus, and being on campus is a positive space for them, and so they're able to escape their realities, even if it's just for a couple of hours while they're on campus or in a classroom. But there's times, and I think we've all experienced that, where when we've had that positive experience and we're out and about, but then something brings back to your remembrance that experience. Yep. And what happens? You smile. Sometimes you're laughing or you're smiling, and whoever you're with is like, what's so funny, or what? And would it be great if majority of our students received a text or email or some type of message from somebody from Rock Valley, and they smile, and it sort of changed their atmosphere? I mean, that's powerful for me.
Well, I mean, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If you don't feel that you belong somewhere, if you don't feel affirmed, if you don't have your social emotional needs met, you can't get to the top of the pyramid and learn or do anything new or create. You just can't. And so I think that that's something I think about a lot in my classroom, especially in the physical space, but trying to figure out how to do that in the online space of how do I create a sense of belonging and affirming and, you know, create a positive social environment, social emotional environment. It's really essential. I think that's I think I see so many students who come to campus and you can just tell that whatever baggage they're bringing from home it's intense. I mean, you know some of these stories. I mean, some of our students are going through hell, and yet they're showing up trying to learn. And I just think they're pretty admirable. It's pretty remarkable. And I think the only thing I can do is try to, like, you know, I live a pretty comfortable life. I'm pretty privileged and middle class, and kids are healthy. My wife's healthy. We've got a job. I have an income. You know, and sure, I get stressed out, and sure, I've got things going on in my life. But compared to some of the stuff my students are experiencing, nothing. And so the least I can do is, like, genuinely engage with them as a human and see them in their humanity and be like, hey, glad you're here, you know, and whatever that looks like. Or remember that they told me 3 weeks ago that, you know, someone's pregnant wife was potentially having some pregnancy issues or you know, dangers, and checking in with them and how are things going without prying, and, you know, respecting people's privacy, but just remembering the things that people tell you, and I think it matters.
It definitely matters. Thank you for sharing that. I was just participating in an eat and greet with students, and I had a small group of students that I was video chatting with, and provided them with meals, lunch, through Grubhub. That was not necessarily a plug, by the way. It just happened to be.
Vendor who delivers food to the car.
Oh my goodness. But in engaging with the students, I had one student who literally is enrolled in a math class simply to learn it at a greater level so that she can be a better tutor to her son who's in remote learning now in the K-12 population. And so I think about that. Then I had another young man who couldn't engage in a lot of the organizational things that he wanted to do in high school. You know, he wanted to participate more, but he couldn't because he had to work a lot. And so he told himself that when he decided to come to RVC, that he would engage more and be more involved. I don't know if enough people understand the importance, truly the importance of engaging students and how that relates to persistence. That, you know, everybody wants to talk about completion, but if you can't get them to come back week after week, you can't get them to complete a semester. You can't get them to complete a year. So I thank you for bringing that up. So now, Dr. Oakes, AKA Matt, I'm gonna change the topic a little bit. You have been an ally, an advocate, a leader in diversity awareness on campus. And so, since you've been here, I've known you to be a part of PACE, Promoting an Inclusive Community Committee on campus. And I know that you've participated in various workshops and things of that nature. But how are you pulling what we call diversity? When we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, how do you pull that into the classroom? How do you integrate that into your curriculum? Whether students understand it or not, how do you make that impactful from a faculty's lens?
I think that, I teach in the humanities. I teach literature classes and I teach writing. And if I think about my literature classes, there's so much you can do to engage with issues of diversity and inclusion and equity when you're just simply selecting what texts to work with or how to respond to texts. I mean, there's a long tradition in literary studies of working with the canon or critiquing the canon or deconstructing the canon. So working with those standard old dead white guy texts and challenging them and then turning around and going, what texts aren't here, right? Who got left out of the canon and how can we go back and think about that? And that's a perfectly disciplinarily appropriate thing to do, right? I wouldn't be doing my job, frankly, in 2020 if I was teaching a literature class and I wasn't thinking about those questions about who's in the canon and who's not in the canon and what texts I'm selecting. In the writing class, I think that it's a different kind of a beast because I teach English 101 and English 103, which basically every single student has to take. And so I'm always a little bit more cautious there because in my literature class, a student decided to take that class. But in English 101, we said, you're showing up to this class. And so I try to give students choices. And I've done it in different ways in terms of topic selection, of saying, you have to write about this. And sometimes that doesn't go so well. Sometimes I say write about anything you like, and then I end up reading essays about how to wash a car or something banal, something that's not really appropriate. And so right now I'm trying to create sort of tracks. Okay, we can work on issues around Confederate monuments. I'm not going to tell you what to say or not going to tell you what to think. We're going to look at different information and different articles, and then you'll work on different assignments inside of that topic. Or you can work on issues around women's rights, or work on issues around environmentalism and climate change and its impact on different vulnerable communities. And so I try to right now I'm trying to do it that way by kind of creating really open spaces that give people choice, but also try to intentionally push students to engage with some topics that I think are essential for students to think about. Again, I'm not going to tell you what to think about those topics, but if it's 2020 and if you have never given any thought to what it means that we still have Confederate monuments in our country, you probably should think about it because it's an important topic that's going on in the world right now. So I think that's, at least from a curriculum planning perspective, that's sort of how I think about the diversity, equity, inclusion piece. From a teaching perspective, I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about just seeing who comes through the door and knowing your data, knowing what kind of student populations are going to be at risk, and trying to check your own biases, and then go from there. I mean, I've had that experience where young black male student sort of acting in a way that I was like, why is he what is his deal? And he was slumped in his chair and it was just this, it made me angry. And then I was like, hold up, Matt, right? What biases are jumping into your brain that are influencing the way you're engaging with this student right now, right? Stop it. Think. Know what you know. Don't let your, reptile brain go the easy route. Challenge those internal assumptions and do something with that and try to figure out another way through. See what's actually happening, not what your lazy brain is trying to tell you is happening. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that's trying to intentionally do that. I think about my transgender students a lot and how important it is for us to create an environment where students just automatically know that they're safe to be out, that I will learn whatever pronoun they want me to use to refer to them, and I will make sure that other people use that pronoun. I mean, I think that again, it goes back to that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't belong, if you don't feel as though you're affirmed, you can't learn. And so I don't think that these are things that are extra things that I think are important, so I bring them to the classroom. I think that they have to be addressed in the classroom, or we can't do our jobs. Because if I don't affirm my trans student or my young black male student in their full humanity, they will not learn what I need them to learn. It won't work. It won't happen. And so I think that the issues around diversity and inclusion and equity are deeply woven to our mission as an institution of education.
I appreciate you sharing that on so many levels. One, it's so important for us to respect each student's individuality. And they have to feel comfortable in their own skin, coming into the classroom, engaging. But then there's a second piece here. You also mentioned that there's a piece about self-reflection. As professionals, and you as a faculty member, me as administrator, we have a sense of authority, right? And so we have that influence that we could navigate or push students towards one way or the other. And if we don't recognize our own privilege, and privilege is a real thing, and if we don't recognize our own privilege, we don't realize sometimes that our privilege could be a negative influence on our students. And if faculty are the #1 retention tool, so to speak, faculty members engage students more so face-to-face than any other professional on campus. And if that student doesn't feel safe, doesn't feel like they can speak to you, then you may not get 100% out of them. Their potential may never be tapped. I think about myself as an African-American student, you know, back in the day when I was a young student.
Wasn't that long ago.
You know, well, thank you, I appreciate that. But I remember having these conversations and these what I thought were strange topics to have in class, and could care less about the topic. But I knew that I had to learn about this topic in order to have a good grade. And I can remember sometimes giving my personal opinion, real opinion, in the class, being authentic, and it impacted my grade for the negative. And so then I learned, okay, don't say what you really feel. Say what you need to say to make sure that faculty member is comfortable with what you said. And then, you know what? Oh, look, I have the grade that I need. And so I appreciate you saying that, because we have to get away from that and allow students to be who they are, their authentic self. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, I think that, you know, and it works the other way too. Like, I know that the minute I walk into the classroom, I'm being read. You know, my students are seeing my skin color, seeing the way that I dress, interpreting the way that I speak, listening to the references that I make about what TV show I was watching the night before. They're reading all of those things, and they're forming a view of me. And that's either going to help or hinder or be hopefully neutral in terms of my job in the room. And I think that's something that sometimes people forget, that they, as an educator, I think sometimes people can think that they are neutral, that they are just like the wallpaper, you know, that they don't show up in the room too. And that's not the case either. I mean, it's a complex little social environment we've got working in that classroom, right? Where we've got however many, 24 to 40 students showing up, plus whatever faculty members showing up in the room, and all those personalities and all those histories and all those identities are coming together. I think it's one of the reasons that I love the classroom, because it's just this really interesting space where we create these little micro communities for 16 weeks. We walk in as strangers, and then hopefully we leave as, I don't know, something else, you know, something positive on the other end. Yeah.
So now I'm trying to figure out in my mind your favorite topic to teach. All right? So share with us your favorite topic to teach. However, let's combine that with maybe there was a time when you taught your favorite topic, subject, maybe author, and the students had the green light, the aha moment, and they caught on to it. One of those favorite times where you love the subject, but the students actually love learning as well. Yeah. If you have one of those stories, feel free to share it with us.
So I don't know that it's my favorite, but it's the one that comes to the mind quickest, because it's certainly one of my funnest things to do. So I teach the class called The Bible as Literature, where we read the Bible, but we do it as a piece of literature, not as a piece of theology or anything else. So we look at it as poetry, as story, as history, as law, as all sorts of other things. And early on in the semester, usually maybe second or third class, we look at the creation story from Genesis. And I draw their attention to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and I start to ask them questions like, what came first? Were the animals created before Eve, or was Eve created after I asked these kinds of questions. And I forgot to say that I assign one half of the room Genesis 1, and I assign the other half of the room Genesis 2. Well, you quickly realize that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 say different things, right? Things are in different orders. And so then and a lot of students, they're like, I've read this a bajillion times, and I've never noticed that they're in different orders, that the order of creation in both stories is different. And so we talk about why that might be, and I invite them to put on their critical thinking hats and say, okay, how did that, why? Like, if I'm sitting down to write a story, I'm not going to start it twice and put things in different orders. That doesn't, why would anyone do that? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we come to the conclusion, which is what the scholarship tells us, that we're actually looking at two different creation stories from two different Hebrew creation myths that at some point got stuck together. And students usually are like, I can't believe that I've looked at this document so many times over my life and never noticed something that was so obvious to me now, that Genesis 1 is one thing and Genesis 2 is another thing. And then we use that as a starting place to talk about what's the source history of this document? Where does it come from? And a lot of students, some students think that it's going to challenge, firstly religious students, that it's going to challenge their faith. But I also have a lot of students that are like, this actually deepened my appreciation for a document that I feel really passionate about. I think that's one of my favorite things to expose students to, is just these light bulb moments around a text that they think they know, and then see some other things about it.
Well, there you have it. Had an opportunity to talk with Dr. Oakes about from his lens on teaching, on learning. We learned a little bit about his approach to engaging students, the diversity within his approach. We went from biblical to digital divide, from writing to computers. And as you can see, higher education and how we engage one another and how we engage students, it's complex. And there's a method to the madness, so to speak. And it's important for us to continue a diverse lens. It's important for us to continue to engage. And it's important for us to always think through PERC, persistence, enrollment, retention, completion. So once again, thank you for being a part of PERC Up with the president, and I'll see you on the next episode.